The living room was in disarray. Glasses were scattered on the consoles, ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts and empty bottles. Victoria, lying on a divan, was listening to jazz while drinking a cup of hot coffee. She glanced at the clock, which read 9 a.m. She was listening to jazz while drinking a hot cup of coffee. At that moment, the front doorbell rang. The knock was discreet. The young woman jumped up and tried to hide some glasses and empty bottles. "I'm coming," she said, stifled, thinking it might be some unwelcome relative. When she opened the door, she found no one. Startled, she looked at the spacious open hallway and the closed elevator door. The lit green arrow indicated to her that her visitor was coming down. At that moment, she lifted her shoulders and closed the door. "Better," he said aloud. As he closed the door, his bare foot stumbled over a piece of paper. He found the torn page of a shoddy notebook on which a few words had been written in pencil. She did not understand the message. "What you pay at the agency." Perplexed, she reread the incomprehensible text several times. The coarseness of the writing frightened her. She ran out to try to catch up with the messenger. She waited a few minutes in front of the elevator, and upon reaching the spacious and luxurious entrance hall, she stood for a moment hesitantly as she met the hostile gaze of the doorman who looked her up and down, the old shorts and men's shirt she was wearing. With dignity, she made her way to the large glass entrance and looked down the deserted, elegant street. At that instant, a black car started up and passed in front of the building. Its sole occupant, a man with black hair and eyebrows, passed in front of her without looking at her. The young woman impulsively turned to the doorman. "Who is the guy in the black car?" Narciso looked at her with mockery. "He moved in a few days ago." Victoria kept silent. Then she faced the doorman again. "Who came to ask for me?" "I don't know. So many people come to see her." "I ask you who came a few moments ago," she said with dignity. "No one. Besides, I'm not here to see who comes up and down to see you." Offended, Victoria turned away. Back in her apartment, she read the note again. She didn't know what the Pagas agency was. She looked in the phone book and almost gasped in terror when she read, "Paid agency burials, burning porridges." He jotted down on the same piece of paper the address and phone number of the agency and hurriedly went inside to get dressed. On her way out, she passed the maid Tomasa, who was returning from the market. "I'll be right back. I'm going to a funeral parlor," she said as she passed. The maid could not answer. When she returned, the lady would tell her what the girl was doing in her absence. In the elevator, she met the man in the black car. The man seemed to ignore her, but Victoria noticed his moustaches and eyebrows so thick and black you'd say false. She was pleased when he stepped out into the hall. On board her car, she crossed the city and arrived at Tacubaya. There he soon found the street marked in the directory. It was a poor and populous street. The agency was modest, and the sign announcing it was large and pompous. She parked her car and got out, determined. She entered the agency, a room with low ceilings and walls decorated with grey and violet cloths. In the room was a desk and, behind it, an old man staring at her. Victoria wanted to go home, but the old man, who was looking at the sheet of paper in her hand, stood up and addressed her. "Are you Miss Victoria Iturbi?" Surprised, she looked frightened at the man and then at the room lined with sombre rags and was speechless. The man moved closer to her and took the paper in her hand. "It's terrible, miss. You are late. The funeral has just taken place." "What?" Victoria asked, not knowing what to say. "We've been trying to reach you since yesterday. We left you several messages, but you didn't show up. Maybe you didn't want to commit yourself. That's how we understood it. A well-mixed young woman with a poor man." "What are you talking about?" The old dwarf looked at her ironically. "Of your friend, the dancer Jimmy Dorsky." Victoria recoiled in horror. Jimmy? Jimmy Dorsky? What happened to him? A car accident. He died almost instantly. The old man fell silent to watch her. But I was with him on Saturday. He didn't dare say more. A young man entered at that moment and watched the scene intently. Victoria turned to the stranger. The old man kept silent and returned to his desk. The newcomer pulled a piece of paper from one of his pockets and approached the old man. The paper was identical to the one she had received and had something written on it in pencil. The old man looked puzzled. "What does this mean?" asked the young man in disgust. "Who are you?" asked the dwarf, putting himself on guard. "Dr. Juan Valadares." "Ah, you're late, doctor. Your friend's funeral has already taken place." "What friend?" "Jimmy Dorsky," answered the old man, pretending to be surprised. The doctor seemed petrified, opened his mouth and then, astonished, looked at the young woman and the old man. "Jimmy Dorsky. I was with him on Saturday until very late. I understand that you were the one who gave the medical certificate." No sooner had he uttered these words than the old man seemed to repent. "Me!" shouted Valadares. "Maybe I was wrong. Nobody came to the funeral. It's a pity. We notified 2 ladies whose names we found among the deceased's papers." "Tell me, why did you say I gave the medical certificate?" The old man approached a file cabinet and searched with parsimony. From time to time he glanced at them furtively. "It's all in order. The medical certificate, the autopsy, the burial permit, all in order." "Who signs the certificate?" asked the doctor angrily. "The signature is unintelligible," said the dwarf, smiling. "Let me see the certificate," demanded the doctor. "It is not necessary, doctor," said the old man maliciously, giving him a wink that indicated complicity. The young woman looked at the doctor reproachfully, and he left without saying goodbye. The young woman asked the dwarf, "Are you sure he was the one who gave the certificate?" "Here is his signature on a sheet of his prescription pad." "Where did the accident happen?" asked Victoria. "On Tacubaya Avenue, on the corner of Juan de la Barrera, at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning." "Where was the burial?" she asked again. "In the garden pantheon. That's where he went." A little old man in charge of the administration informed her that indeed it had taken place this morning, and perhaps because the young man was a foreigner, no one had gone to his burial. Victoria asked to see the file. There was an autopsy waiver signed by a Dr. Andrade who worked at the Juarez hospital. The death certificate had been issued by Dr. Juan Valadares. Victoria stayed and then went to the grave. She walked through the lonely and silent cemetery. On a hill she discovered the recently opened grave of Jimmy Dorsky. 2 tall men in light suits stood there. They looked like foreigners, and upon seeing her, respectfully withdrew. Victoria knelt down and prayed for a few minutes. Then she hurried away. She wanted to go to the Tacubaya delegation. Something told her that Jimmy's death was not as accidental as it seemed. The doctor, for his part, leaving the Pagas agency, hurried to the house where his friend had lived. For him, Jimmy's death was not clear either, and the old man's statement that he had signed the certificate seriously compromised him. He was received by Doña Jesus, the owner of the house that rented a room to Jimmy. "Oh, doctor, what a great misfortune. You were such good friends," she said when she saw him arrive. "When did you find out?" "They told me last night, but I couldn't go. I'm so old. This morning 2 friends of yours came, and when I told them the news, they almost couldn't believe it." "What friends? What were they like?" The landlady described 2 tall foreigners with light suits and respectful faces. From here they went to the cemetery to see if they could reach the burial. "Did you already know them, Doña Jesus?" "No, they had never come. I think they were from your land." Juan then asked the lady to let him go into Jimmy's room to pick up some books he had lent her. The lady let him in, but refused to accompany him. She did not want to see Jimmy's room. Everything was still very new. Juan went in alone. The room was untouched. You could tell that Jimmy was going to appear at any moment with his clear, sparkling eyes and his laughter. Juan checked the closet. Jimmy's meager clothes hung in disarray, and the socks were unmatched. The bed was disheveled. Maybe Jimmy had taken a nap before he left. He found nothing to catch his eye. He picked up his books and, on his way out, saw an empty cigarette pack lying on the floor. Its color and paper were unusual, and Juan bent down to pick it up. He thought that was what they did in mystery movies, and that these tricks almost always worked. He went back to the table and saw that the basket was full of cigarette butts. Either Jimmy was nervous and had smoked a lot that day, or someone had come to visit him. Did someone come to visit him on Saturday? He asked Doña Jesus. No, nobody. He didn't call on the phone either, which was rare for him. He spent the day alone in his room. He went out until 3 o'clock. He said goodbye to the lady and promised to visit her again sometime. He had to act fast before the young woman he had met at the agency called the police. He drove to the corner where the old man told him the accident had occurred. He parked his car and discovered a garage on one of the corners of the intersection. The garage was the only possible source of information. He went inside, trying to conceal his nerves. A mechanic came out to attend to him. "Is the garage open at night?" he asked. "Yes, sir," replied the mechanic. "What do you know about the accident that happened here on Saturday night?" "I was a witness, sir. I was in here when I heard the breaking and the scream. When I got out, I only caught a glimpse of the fleeing black car. I couldn't get the license plates. The young man was lying there on the curb. He had gotten out of the jeep that was left nearby. His friend, who was behind him in his car, soon arrived." "What friend?" Juan Valadares asked. "A doctor who was with him and who called several ambulances. The first one that arrived took the young man away. There was a lot of blood coming out of his ears. Afterwards I went with the doctor to the police station to declare what I saw." "Did the wounded man go to the police station?" "No, sir. The private ambulance took him to a private clinic. The doctor gave the medical statement. You know that crosses are always late, and the young man was in very bad shape." Juan seemed to reflect. He looked at where his friend had fallen and where the jeep had been found. The impact must have been very strong, since Jimmy's vehicle was quite far from the curb. "The jeep must have been totaled?" he commented. "So far, no. It didn't even look like it had crashed. Surely with the pure braking the young man was thrown off and the jeep rolled here." The garage attendant came out to interrupt the conversation. Juan excused himself. The dead man was a good friend of his. "Did he die?" asked the mechanic. "Yes," he answered somberly. Juan returned to his car, bewildered. He did not know where to go. The proximity of the doctor, who had taken his name at the scene of the accident, and his decision to take Jimmy to a private clinic made it clear that a crime had been committed with Jimmy. The mechanic himself said that the jeep was almost intact and far removed from the body. Maybe Jimmy was deliberately run over with the black car. But how? He felt oppressed. He thought sadly of his explosions of anger and laughter that were now forever extinguished. The accusing eyes of the young woman from the Pagas agency were the announcement of what could happen to him if he did not rush to prove that he was innocent in that accident that seemed less and less like an accident. Who would the young woman be? Jimmy had never spoken to him about her, but Jimmy was lucky with pretty women. Victoria entered the Tacubaya police station with determination. Indeed, on Saturday there had been an accident at the corner of Tacubaya and Juan de la Barrera. 2 young men, one in a jeep and the other in a grey Volkswagen, were leaving a party to go to a friend's house when a third black car, driven by an unknown driver, came out and caused the accident in which Jimmy Dorsky was injured. His friend, Dr. Juan Valadares, called several ambulances and chose the first one that arrived so that his friend could receive immediate medical attention. Victoria read the medical release signed by Valadares. A garage mechanic had witnessed the accident. Victoria wrote down the license plate number of the doctor's Volkswagen, M23G17, the name of the clinic where the injured man had been taken, Valadares' address, and the address of the house from where they left together to go to the house of a certain Celia. "She was a relative of mine," said the young woman to the employee of the delegation to justify her interest. On the way out, Victoria saw Jimmy's jeep at the back of the courtyard. She went over to examine it. The jeep was intact. Juan Valadares, for his part, went to a tobacco stand and showed the cigarette box found in his friend's room. The cigarette seller, an old woman wrapped in a blue coat and wearing a lot of makeup, did not know her. "It is a brand that is not imported into Mexico," she said. "Are you sure?" Valadares asked. "Yes, sir, and if you don't believe me, don't ask me," she said angrily. Juan examined the pack again carefully. He only knew that the letters indicated something in Greek. "And how is this packet here?" he insisted. The woman kept silent. She didn't like untimely people. At the same time, Victoria arrived at the Santa Ella clinic. The smell of absorbent cotton and medicine made her nauseous. The administration man made her wait a few minutes before attending to her. "Miss, I assure you that you are mistaken. We did not receive any wounded person of that name here on Saturday night," he told her impatiently and stubbornly. "Well, an ambulance came from here to pick him up." "I repeat that no ambulance left and that we had no knowledge of that case," the employee replied sternly. Then, to reassure her, he showed her the logbook for Saturday and Sunday, since the accident had occurred at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning. Victoria had to beat a retreat. Now she was convinced that Jimmy's death was a serious mystery, a crime. Without hesitation, she went to the Condesa building where the woman who had given the party that Jimmy and Valadares had attended lived. The whitish buildings, with faded windows, seemed sinister to him. He parked his car and found out where Mrs. Candano lived. He crossed one of the cement patios, took a staircase that creaked under his steps. He reached the 3rd floor. At the stairway landing there were 3 unpainted doors. He chose 9A, which was the one that appeared on the delegation's minutes. He knocked. After a few minutes, a female voice asked from the other side of the door, "Who? Who's calling?" "Me, a friend of Jimmy's." A woman Victoria couldn't make out at first opened the door and ushered her in. A hallway of broken, unwaxed staves creaked under her footsteps. The woman led her into a room of dirty floors and shabby furniture. There were no curtains on the windows, and the couches were covered in greenish, tattered slang. On the walls were posters with theatre programs in various languages and some newspaper clippings that Victoria didn't get to read. The air was parched and smelled of old nicotine. On the painted tables were ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts and used glasses. An open record player and several records in disarray and out of their envelopes were scattered all over the floor. Victoria looked at the owner of the house. She was all greenish, like her furniture. She wore a black sweater, and from her chest hung a thick silver chain that held the head of an African demon in the middle of her chest. "I am Victoria Iturbe. I was a disciple of Jimmy Dorsky. Are you Mrs. Candano?" The woman nervously smoked a cigarette. "Yes, miss. Jimmy is dead," said Victoria loudly. The woman's eyes widened feverishly, almost pallid. She took a long drag on her cigarette and exhaled. "Dead? If he was here on Saturday, then that's what the paper they brought me this morning meant." "Did a friend of Jimmy's give it to you? A doctor he brought here on Saturday?" "Did you give it to him?" asked Victoria. "No, miss. The doctor came in this morning to pick up a prescription pad he misplaced. He thought he might have lost it here at the party. I was so upset with the note from the Pagas agency, and he offered to go in my place. I haven't heard anything else since." "Didn't he tell you about Jimmy's death? Do you know that he himself gave the death certificate on Saturday night?" Mrs. Candano opened her mouth. "It's not possible. I loved Jimmy very much. So handsome, so cheerful." "Was Valadares with Jimmy at the time of the accident?" said Victoria. "He and Jimmy left here together." "What time did they leave, ma'am?" "At 2 o'clock in the morning," said the woman, about to faint. "The accident happened at the same time." The doorbell interrupted the dialogue. Victoria offered to go and open the door. Mrs. Candano seemed close to having a crisis. The young woman went through the house, and when she opened the door, she found Juan Valadares, who recoiled in fright when he saw her. "Come in, doctor." The doctor obeyed submissively. In the living room he found himself in front of Mrs. Candano, who looked at him with dying eyes. "Why didn't you tell me it was Jimmy?" she reproached him. "I went to run some errands, ma'am. I have been involved in this matter. The worst thing is that I have no alibi because I actually went out with Jimmy, and from here I went home. Nobody saw me arrive. I live alone. I'm single." "They couldn't see you. If you are with Jimmy, tell me, where did you take him? I already went to the Santa Ella clinic and Jimmy never arrived there." The doctor jumped up and looked at her in terror. "They didn't take him there? Then there is no doubt that he was murdered," exclaimed the doctor in a deep voice. "You went out with him," said Mrs. Candano, straightening up accusingly. "Jimmy insisted that I wait for him. He wanted us to go to Celia's house, but once on the street he changed his mind. He was very capricious." "Don't you remember? Celia lives in Tacubaya," said Mrs. Candano, looking at him. Victoria also looked at him with terrible eyes. He felt lost. "And I lost my prescription pad. That's why I came this morning. I thought I had forgotten it here," he said, crushed by the suspicions that weighed on him. "What a coincidence!" cried Victoria triumphantly. "Sir, call the police!" shouted Mrs. Candano. Juan Valadares stopped the young woman violently as she was going to the telephone. "Let me go," said Victoria in a firm voice. "Stop! You are going to die too," answered Juan, shaking her. "I screamed for help." Juan threw the young woman and ran for the exit. Victoria followed him and almost caught up with him on the stairs. On the street she saw him get into a grey Volkswagen. The young woman got into her American car and ran after him. The Volkswagen took the direction of Bosque de Chapultepec to leave towards the Madereros road. Victoria caught up with him near the Toluca exit. There she crossed his car, much more powerful than that of Juan Valadares. The latter, defeated, leaned on the steering wheel and waited. "Do what you want." Victoria opened her bag and took out the notes she had taken at the police station. To her surprise, the license plates of Juan's car did not match those of the Volkswagen that had shown up with the doctor at the police station. Victoria leaned out of the window and shouted, "He changed the plates, didn't he? Bandit." "What plates? I don't know what you're talking about." Victoria got out of her car and menacingly advanced towards him. She threw the paper in his face. Juan picked it up, startled, and read it. "Miss, my car is a 63 Volkswagen and the delegation's car is a 61. "What?" Victoria snatched the paper from him. "Indeed," said the young lady after a few seconds. "Believe me, miss, I am innocent. They used my name to cover up Jimmy's crime. I also made inquiries this morning. Do I look like a murderer?" he asked honestly. Juan got out of his car and looked her straight in the face. "You are so brave that you must help me out of this mess. You understand that I can't go to the police. They would arrest me right away, and that's what the murderers want." Victoria reflected. The man seemed sincere. She looked him up and down. He was very young and good-looking. He wore white doctor's shoes and had impeccable doctor's hands. "Well, what do you want me to do?" he asked warily. "I don't know. Let's go somewhere where we can talk quietly. I haven't eaten." "Neither have I. You go ahead of me and watch out if he tries to escape," Victoria ordered. Juan returned to his car and started back to the city. Through the rear-view mirror, he always looked at his enemy's car, following it very closely. Now the doctor was not running. He was going at a more moderate speed. In spite of himself, he smiled at the young woman's decision not to allow him to escape. She was a powerful ally. He stopped in front of a restaurant in Colonia Juarez. They occupied a secluded table and ordered a sandwich. Neither of them had much of an appetite. Juan looked at her carefully. "Did you love Jimmy very much?" he asked her point blank. "Yes, he was my tap teacher, but he was also my very dear friend. On Saturday after class, he asked me to help him send some food packages to his mother. His mother lives in Prague," said the young woman thoughtfully. "She is a widow and lives alone," said Valadares melancholy. "I have the packages in the trunk of my car," added Victoria. They ate in silence, observing each other. "The first thing we must know is who the real owner of the grey Volkswagen that went to the police station is," said Juan. Suddenly, he seemed to remember something and took out the cigarette pack he had found in Jimmy's room. He showed it to Victoria. "They were in his room. There are no such cigars in Mexico. They are Greek cigars." "Only in the movies do you find a criminal for a pack of cigars," said Victoria pedantically. "But to find out from the plates, you have to go to the police," said Juan, worried. Suddenly he jumped up and ran to the phone. "I'm going to call the consulate," he said. He consulted the directory and dialed the number. "It's you. I warn you that I have already given your general information to the police. It won't be long before they find him," said the woman's excited voice from the other end of the line. Juan approached Victoria, depressed. "What do they do for art? After 2 divorces they're hysterical. We'd better get out of here." The actress already called the police. They paid in a hurry and decided to leave in her car. First of all, they would go to see Didier, a crime columnist, a friend of Juan's. Maybe he could get the identity of the man. Maybe he could get the identity of the man with the M23 G17 plates. Victoria admired Didier's casual manner and his whiskey drinking. The journalist's apartment, next door to the restaurant where they had eaten, was full of newspaper clippings and papers. The couches were wide and covered with cushions. Didier listened to the story and in a few minutes obtained, through a mysterious friend whom he telephoned, the name of the owner of the vehicle and his address. "The man's name is Ulysses Katakis. The plates are from the state of Mexico. The guy is a medical intern. He lives at 80 Amsterdam Street." Didier got up to pour himself another glass of whiskey. From there, he glanced at Victoria, who was looking at him admiringly. "Is Katakis a Greek man?" the young woman asked. "Yes, Miss Iturbe," replied Didier, looking at her legs. Juan stood up to say goodbye. He turned to Didier, but the latter was still absorbed in the contemplation of Victoria. "Be careful, child. You don't know who your little friend Jimmy really was," warned the journalist. "I don't know who Jimmy was. Jimmy was—" Victoria's eyes got misty. "He was very generous and very good-looking," added Juan, looking at Victoria with concern. "You, Juan, are running a serious risk. Let's see if they don't put you in a cage." Juan Valadares paled, telling the journalist that his name appeared at the bottom of the death certificate. They hurried out with the information written in Juan's notebook. "He's a Greek. I wonder why he never told me about any of his friends of that nationality. And you?" "Me neither," answered Victoria, worried. "I think we should go to the consulate. They must have information about him. He must have been living in Mexico for a long time." In a tobacconist's shop, they asked for the directory to find the address of the consulate. While Victoria searched busily, Juan observed her delicate hands and the grace of her bent neck in the open book. He felt the impulse to stroke the tips of her hair that fell on the nape of her neck. The young woman raised her eyes in surprise. "I loved him very much." "Yes, but Jimmy had to be loved from afar. almost like an inhabitant of another planet who was just passing among us. There was something priceless about him. He was a fugitive, she said thoughtfully, and looked up the address again. "Here he is!" she shouted. She was surprised to find that the consulate was located on a street almost behind the building where she lived. He looked up from time to time as he guided the young woman's car through the city. "And did he love her very much?" he asked shyly. "Jimmy. He loved everybody. He was an enthusiast. One day he interrupted class to kiss me and say, 'I don't think I'm coming back. You're too pretty. I wouldn't want to kill myself for you when I have to leave.' Then he burst out laughing. A few days later he told me that to console himself for not being able to love me, he had bought a Jeep. We went for a drive and he told me about Prague. He never kissed me again. Until Saturday before he left, he said to me, 'Vicky, I will never forget that you were my most beloved student.' And he left. His eyes were so sad. Maybe she had a premonition that she was going to die. Do you remember that her eyes were the reflection of true joy or true sorrow? They found themselves in a small street, shaded by slender trees. The consulate was a mansion. They parked the car. "We'll go to Prague and tell his mother how we loved him, won't we?" asked Victoria, taking Juan by the hand. "Of course we'll go," shouted Juan, surprised at the proposal. The hallway of the consulate was open and revealed the interior of a garden full of foliage. To the left, they could see the first steps of a staircase leading to the residence. At the bottom of the garden, lost among the trees, a pavilion with clear walls and large windows appeared to be the servants' quarters or offices. As they entered, a drizzle threatened to turn into a storm. They reached the steps without finding anyone to stop or guide them, and advanced without hesitation to the pavilion at the back of the garden. The polished glass door made them look at each other in surprise. They found themselves in an office with waxed floors, and in the presence of an old man sitting at a desk behind a wooden railing of turned bars. The office was spacious and luxurious. Behind the railing, at the back of the room, a spiral staircase, also made of wood, led to the upper floor. The man at the desk looked at them curiously. "What can I do for you?" he said kindly. "We would like to speak to the consul," asked the young woman. The man looked at them attentively. He took out a cigarette and lit it. Victoria and Juan saw in his hands an orange pack, like the one the doctor had found in Jimmy's room. "I don't have any cigarettes," said Juan, reaching into his pockets. The official handed him one of his own. "Try a Greek cigarette," he said gallantly. "It is perfect, neither too mild nor too strong." "You can't get them here?" asked Juan, inhaling the perfume of the Greek tobacco. "They are sent to us from Greece for the use of the embassy and consulate staff," said the man, smiling, satisfied. There was silence. Victoria looked at the man, who seemed calm. "What business brings them?" "The consul is not here now," said the man after a few seconds. "We will wait for him," answered Victoria, taking a seat on a bench placed in front of the railing. Juan imitated her. The man seemed startled. "Come tomorrow, from 9 to 2, which are office hours," he said sternly. "So why is it open now?" "Our business is very urgent," Victoria replied insolently. "It is not open," replied the official, surprised by the girl's audacity. A few minutes passed. The man looked at them, half with surprise, half with anger. Suddenly, he decided to speak. "May I know what you want?" "We want to know about a certain Ulysses Katakis," said the young woman calmly. The man paled. He bit his lips and did not answer. Outside there was a clap of thunder, then more. The afternoon thunderstorm grew stronger by the second. The windows were covered with a curtain of water that blocked the view of the garden. The din of the storm prevented the young people from hearing the man's voice as he called out to Victoria. The girl saw the man stand up. "Come in, miss," he said, opening the gate of the railing. Victoria stood up, puzzled. She turned to see Juan, who imitated her gesture. "Only you, miss," added the official. The young woman approached him. The man was of unusual stature and corpulence. "Wait for me," said Victoria, addressing her friend, who, standing there, did not know what to do. She advanced with the man to the spiral staircase. They went upstairs to a more elegant office than the first one. Its ceilings were low, and the walls were lined with a dark wood. The man occupied a spacious desk and offered the young woman a seat across from him. He looked at her with eyes before and said, "Miss, I am the consul." Victoria was startled to hear the confession. She looked around and saw that the door leading to the staircase had been closed by someone she had not seen. She was alone with the man who was watching her intently. She thought she had fallen into a trap set by Juan Valadares. Katakis is implicated in Jimmy Dorsky's crime. The consul avoided looking at her. He lit another cigarette. He was visibly disturbed. He stood up and opened a file cabinet. He remained silent for a few minutes. "You said Katakis. We don't have him on record. You are mixed up in the Jimmy Dorsky crime. If you can't help us, we'll go to the police." There was a silence between the two of them. Victoria was sure the man was looking for a way out. "What is the name of the young man with her?" asked the consul, who continued looking in the file cabinet. "Victoria Iturbe, Juan Valadares." "Juan Valadares?" asked the consul, almost in spite of himself. "He and I are investigating the crime. Katakis gave the autopsy certificate, and 2 Greek officials went to Jimmy's funeral this morning." "What are you saying? That 2 Greek officials went to that young man's funeral?" "Yes, I saw them." "Can you describe them to me?" said the consul, visibly worried. "Of course, one was blonde, the other was brown, and both were tall and wore light suits. I even remember the color of their eyes. In the consulate there is no one of those signs. It would be better for you and your friend to withdraw from this matter." "Withdraw?" "Jimmy Dorsky was my friend. This morning the Greeks went to look for Jimmy at his house. The landlady wouldn't let them in. She already knew he was dead." The consul approached her desk and stared at her. "The presence of these 2 individuals is a threat to you. It is best that you drop this matter. After all, your friend is already dead and buried. Believe me, the best thing you can do is to forget about this." Victoria looked toward the closed door. The man moved a button from his desk, and the door opened without a sound. Behind the door stood Juan Valadares, visibly discomposed. They hurried down the stairs. They wanted to leave that place that seemed dangerous to them. As they went out into the garden, the rain lashed their faces and clothes. It was getting dark. They ran to the hallway just as a tall man, with incredibly black eyebrows and whiskers, was crossing it to go to the pavilion from which they had just left. "It's him," said Victoria as soon as she saw the street. "Who?" asked Juan. "The man who moved into the apartment above mine a few days ago." They found the trunk of the car open. Someone had stolen the food packages Jimmy had ordered for his mother. "It was the neighbor!" Victoria shouted, starting to panic for the first time. Juan took the wheel. It was dangerous for Victoria to drive in the nervous state she was in. To calm her down, he turned on the car radio and looked for some cheerful music. The music ended. The announcer's voice began, announcing, "Didier, the on-air columnist." The young people looked at each other. What happened to Jimmy Dorsky? His friends Juan Valadares and Victoria Iturbe are concerned about the unclear death of the Czechoslovakian dancer, which occurred on Sunday at dawn in a downtown cruiser. The circumstances of Dorsky's death are quite strange. His friends wonder if it was a crime or if it was an accident. Juan turned off the radio and looked at Victoria, who was listening to the columnist with inordinate attention. He patted her cheek. Victoria turned to look at her friend. She thanked him for the endearments. "Let's go see the Greek who took my name," said Juan. Number 80. Amsterdam Street belonged to a yellowish building from the 1930s. Its heavy architecture, with concave windows and dirty glass, gave it an appearance of premature old age. The hallway was very narrow. They entered trying not to trip over the raised floor tiles. An electric spotlight illuminated the grease-covered walls. To the left, a staircase with nickel-plated railings and broken steps awaited them. The darkness of the stairwell almost made them recoil. The landings were long, narrow corridors in which there were several doors, each with a number indicating the various departments. They checked the numbers without finding the one they were looking for and took the second flight of stairs. They passed a tall young man hurrying down the stairs. The stranger bumped into Victoria. "Excuse me, sir, which is Mr. Katakis's apartment?" asked the young woman, noticing that her interlocutor was carrying a suitcase. The stranger stopped, puzzled. He tried to look at them carefully, as if he didn't want their faces to blur, or as if he had already seen them before. "I don't know. I don't think a person of this name lives here." He ran down the stairs. "I think it's him," Victoria murmured in Juan's ear. They found the number they were looking for on the third floor. The door marked 30 was the same as the others. Victoria crossed herself before knocking, and Juan crossed his fingers behind his back. After a while, a woman's voice asked, "Is that you?" "Yes, it's me," Juan answered quietly. They heard locks running, and a woman appeared before them who seemed to be anemic. They looked at each other in surprise. The woman brushed back the black strands that fell over her eyes and looked at them in fright. Juan pushed her aside and entered without asking permission, taking advantage of the woman's surprise. Victoria entered after him. The owner stood in the doorway. "Ulysses Katakis," said Juan in a confident voice. "I don't understand how they dare to enter a lady's house like that." The woman had a foreign accent. The young men saw that the door was very old and unpainted, but it had been fitted with new locks. The little room they were in had dirty walls, which had once been grey, and had silver triangles. On a small table made of shabby wood, there were 2 plates with leftover bread and cheese. 2 wine-stained glasses accompanied them. The rest of the furniture was equally austere. The orange silk lampshades were frayed. Everything was as anachronistic as its owner, who appeared in several portraits hanging on the walls with her hair loose, her shoulders bare, and gauze covering her throat. The woman approached them. "We are looking for Mr. Ulysses Katakis," said Juan. "I don't know him. I am Mrs. Theoropoulou." "Is he a foreign man?" asked Victoria, feeling in danger. "Greek," answered the lady with aplomb. The friends were silent. "Now, do you want to tell me who you are?" Juan was about to say something when Victoria made a sign to show him a diploma of help in the name of Ulysses Katakis hanging on the wall. Juan turned to look at it. The old woman noticed that the 2 of them had discovered the diploma and collapsed into a chair. "It's a souvenir of Ulysses. You remind me of him. Take care, young man. There are so many dangers." Juan approached the woman solicitously. "Are you feeling ill, madam?" He took her pulse and found it very agitated. "It will pass," said the woman, almost faint. "And where is Ulysses now?" asked Victoria, looking hard at the woman. "Oh, if I could only know. He disappeared. Gone." The woman stared at him blankly. Mrs. Theoropoulou seemed to fall into a strange stupor. Her stray eyes met those of the young men, as if she did not recognize them. John looked at her with fear. "Let's go," he whispered in Victoria's ear. From the door they said good night. The old woman did not seem to notice anything. As soon as the door had closed, Mrs. Theoropoulou jumped up and ran lightly to bolt the locks. Then she raised her fist threateningly and said hatefully, "You'll see, you'll see, you'll see, damn you!" Juan and Victoria did not see the man with the suitcase who, hidden in the doorway of the corridor, spied their exit. As soon as they descended the stairs, the man slipped to the door. He waited a few seconds and knocked. Mrs. Theoropoulou opened the door to let him in. "They're all Greeks," said Victoria as they got into the car. "What did you think of this Medea?" For a moment she almost convinced me of her illness, but then I saw her danger. She's a mother wolf. That's why I wanted us to leave at once. I was looking at the knife on the table. To defend Ulysses, she is capable of anything. They needed to retrieve the papers from the Pagas agency. They wanted an expert to check the signatures before the old man destroyed the papers. At that hour, the street was still and dark. The poverty of the neighborhood made it even more sordid. The door of the agency, illuminated by the letters Pompas Funebres in blue neon, appeared dark in the reflection. Inside, Mr. Pagas, behind his desk, was doing the accounts. From outside, Victoria and Juan watched him for a while to make sure the old man was alone. When they entered, Juan kicked open the door. He wanted to scare him from the beginning, just like in gangster movies. The old man looked at him in terror. Juan approached him and, without a word, grabbed him by the neck as if he was going to strangle him. "Tell me, who gave you my name?" The old man looked at him terrified. He could not speak. He let out a few grunts. Victoria opened the file cabinet and hurriedly searched for the letter D. Immediately she found the name Dorsky. "Tell me, where is Jimmy Dorsky's death certificate?" said Juan in a threatening voice, squeezing the old man's throat. "Here it is," said Victoria, waving a bundle of papers. Juan let go of the old man, throwing him against his chair. Miserable. When they reached the door, the old man ran up and stopped them. "Please don't leave me alone. They will kill me. I am innocent." "Forget that we visited you. You don't want to die twice," Juan told him, giving him a shove that sent him rolling into the wall. From the floor, the old man gave one last pleading look. They ran to the car and disappeared. Now it was necessary to review the papers stolen from the old man and reflect on what they should do. They decided to go to Victoria's house. There was no safer place to talk about the serious things they were going to discuss. Arriving in the brightly lit hall of her building, they saw two smartly dressed individuals waiting for the elevator. Next to them was a very large trunk as well. Victoria turned to the doorman. "Nobody called me?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the two men who at that moment were putting the trunk into the elevator. "Yes, they called you all day long." "Where are those men going?" she asked when she saw the elevator doors closing. "To 32, to Mr. Constantine's floor." Victoria's legs went slack. Juan remained impassive. When she arrived home, Tomasa greeted her with reproaches. "A man has been calling all day, child. I'll tell your mother when she arrives from Sinaloa." "Shut up and don't make me more nervous," said Victoria violently. Tomasa went to the kitchen. It was evident that the girl did not want her presence. As soon as she disappeared, the youngsters went to examine the stolen papers. They found a receipt signed by Pagas, proving payment for Jimmy Dorsky's burial. The receipt was in the name of Juan Valadares. The same clip held the death certificate issued by Juan Valadares and an autopsy waiver signed by Dr. Ulysses Andrade. They were surprised by a telegram from the city of Los Angeles. "I authorize the Pagas agency to carry out the burial of my son, Jimmy Dorsky, Anna Dorsky. If we go to the police with that telegram, we can prove that Jimmy's mother lives in Czechoslovakia and that the telegram is to hide a crime," said Victoria triumphantly. "We can't prove it because they stole the food packages with Jimmy's mother's address on them," said Juan, dejected. "Anyway, the telegram holds the key. The police must question Pagas. First, we need the evidence against him." They kept silent. It was evident that this was a tangle they were incapable of deciphering. "What are those men carrying in the trunk?" asked Juan, jumping up and down. Victoria thought for a while and then decided, "We must go in there." They discussed for a long time how to get into Constantin's house. It was almost impossible, but they decided to try. "Tomasa, go away," ordered the young woman in a serious voice. The maid raised her shoulders and looked angrily at the young woman. She left without saying good night. They both heard when she slammed the door as she left through the service door. Then they took the elevator and arrived in the hall, almost embracing. Narciso watched them pass with reproachful eyes. They went out into the street in an embrace and looked for the phone booth located 3 blocks away. Juan would call. Victoria preferred to go in with her friend. She was afraid to be alone on the street. Juan dialed the number of Victoria's building and waited for Narciso to answer. Victoria moved closer to Juan's face, trying to hear what was happening on the phone, and the young man turned and kissed her almost without knowing why. At that moment, Narciso's voice was heard. Juan, disturbed, put his arm around Victoria's waist. "Who is speaking?" Narciso's voice repeated again. "I want to speak to Mr. Constantine," he said, turning to kiss Victoria again. She remained very still and hugged him tightly. She did not answer. "It is not possible. 2 friends of mine have just arrived with a trunk that I sent," said Juan, kissing the girl again, who now leaned her head on his shoulder. "Those gentlemen have been gone for a while now." She doesn't answer. "Insist," Juan ordered, kissing the girl again. "There is no one," answered Narciso, hanging up the phone. They stayed in the cabin for a long time. It seemed that they had just discovered that kissing was something sweet, and they forgot the rest. Behind a tree, a man was watching them. He hid in the dark when he saw them walking down the sidewalk, holding hands. They often stopped to kiss. When they got close to the building, Juan crossed the sidewalk and stood there, watching the inside of the hall. Victoria entered very straight and passed by Narciso without looking at him. Juan watched her from outside. She went to the elevator and waited for a while. Suddenly, she hit her forehead with her hand and returned to the counter from where Narciso was watching her. "I forgot my key again, Narciso," she said in a honeyed voice. "I can't leave the switchboard." "You're going to leave me in the street. Don't be naughty. Come and open the door." After a few minutes of discussion, Narciso agreed to lend him the master key. "Put it down right away," he said angrily. Victoria ran to the elevator and disappeared. At that moment, Juan entered and addressed the doorman. "Didn't you notice if I had my briefcase?" The man did not answer. He just looked at him with contempt. Offended, Juan headed for the elevator. "Since you are going up, tell the lady to bring down the master key." He found Victoria at the door of her apartment. They walked silently up to Constantine's floor. Juan snatched the key from Victoria's hand and confidently made his way to the white door marked 32. The door gave way. Downstairs in the large lighted hall, the man who had followed the couple from the phone booth appeared. He entered safely, walked past Narcissus with his hat pulled down over his eyes, and headed for the elevator. The doorman followed him there. The stranger glared at him. "Where is he going?" "To the 3rd one." Narciso did not have time to add a word, because the man disappeared behind the automatic elevator doors. Juan entered cautiously into the muffled hall of the strange floor. Victoria followed him. The lobby and Constantine's living room were dark and almost empty. They were illuminated only by the evening light filtering through the wide, curtainless windows. Juan paused for a few moments, almost at the entrance to the open hall. Against the wall was the large trunk that the 2 men had brought up an hour or so ago. Juan approached it and saw that it was empty. Victoria signaled him that the kitchen light was on. They crept over there. With infinite caution, they pushed open the spring-loaded door and peered inside. No one was there. On the table were 3 place settings and several half-empty pans and wine bottles. The plates were dirty and breadcrumbs scattered on the table without a tablecloth. It was clear that 3 people had just dined. The ashtrays were overflowing with cigarette butts. Juan walked over and found the stub of a cigarette butt still smouldering. They looked at each other in fright and ran to hide on the terrace that served as a laundry room and clothes dryer. At that instant, a man's footsteps were heard entering the kitchen. The man started to heat water to make more coffee. Another man was with him. "Don't worry, we'll take it out in the trunk. It's the only way we won't get caught." The men left the kitchen. Juan and Victoria fled when they turned off the light button. "A corpse?" Victoria sighed. Juan covered her mouth with his hand. They were both trembling. They waited for a while. They had to get out of the apartment and out of their hiding place. The place was a mousetrap. Juan advanced through the dark kitchen. From there, half opening the door, he surveyed the living room, which remained dark and silent. He signaled to Victoria, and she came along with him. Once in the living room, they looked for the exit door. When someone made a noise inside the house, the two ran to hide behind the open trunk that was waiting for them in a corner near the exit door. Two men entered the living room, Konstantin and Katakis. They both came in shirt sleeves and smoked without suspecting that someone was spying on them. Konstantin turned to the phone. "Those assholes complicated everything. I don't think there's room for two in the trunk," he said as he dialed a number. "It would be better to take 2 trips, said Andrade Katakis. "It would make me suspicious. That porter is looking at me suspiciously. I don't know if that brat said anything to him." Katakis passed by, nervously smoking. "They don't answer. The truck must have left for here by now. It shouldn't be long," said Konstantin, hanging up the device. "I'm sure Valadares and the brat are peeping through some window. It was a mistake to implicate them. They've gone crazy. Maybe they're going to call the police. We never thought she and Valadares knew each other," answered Katakis. "Turn on the radio. At this hour the news is on," ordered Konstantin. Ulysses Katakis turned on a transistor that was hanging on the floor. The announcer announced, "What news about the death of Jimmy Dorsky? The alleged murderer, Dr. Juan Valadares, has not come forward with the police. So far, it has been impossible to apprehend him, since he has been missing since early morning." "Poor Juan," said another voice from the door, communicating the living room with the interior of the house. Juan and Victoria looked at each other in horror and peered through the crack of the open trunk. Victoria shrieked, "Jimmy!" The 3 men rushed over the trunk, and Juan and Victoria were confronted by Konstantin, Katakis, and Jimmy. The latter, in shirt sleeves and with blonde hair over his forehead, looked at them in agony. "You found us out," said Konstantin, dropping his arms. Jimmy grabbed Juan by the lapels, threatening to hit him. "I'll take care of you. You're not going to screw up Jimmy's life and mine for assholes." Jimmy intervened, separating the 2 men. "They don't know anything," he said violently. Then he stared at his friends. They gawked at him. He seemed very calm. "Do they know what they have done?" "They have murdered Jimmy," said Konstantin. "I don't understand. I don't understand anything," muttered Juan Valadares. Jimmy took out a cigarette and lit it sadly. Then he patted Juan on the back and stroked the tip of his nose with a finger. "Of course they don't understand anything. I'll tell you what's going on. My father was a Czech diplomat. He was killed in a purge. I was in New York when that happened, and I never went back to my country. My mother lives in Prague. Recently, my compatriots wanted me to do a job that I should have left between this Sunday and Monday. If I refused, not only would I die, but my mother would die as well. The consul of Greece was a great friend of my father. I asked him for help, and he decided to save me. But to save me, I had to be killed. We made the plan. Konstantin moved here so that I could visit him without arousing suspicion. Since you, Vicky, live in this building, we had to act quickly. We did not have an accomplice doctor, and I, Juan, stole your prescription book from the old man's house. We paid Pagus a good sum to bury a coffin with a sack of sand inside. Katakis, who is a medical intern, hired a private ambulance and filled me with red ink in case there were any witnesses. He never called the crosses. Then they put me in a trunk and brought me here. That's how the case got here. To make my death public, we decided to warn two women who didn't know each other. What we don't know is how you, Juan, went to the agency instead of the old man. I went to her house to see if I had lost my prescription book there, and she asked me to go and see what the note she had just received meant. Ah, there's the mistake, Jimmy laughed. Then he added, I shouldn't have brought that prescription pad, nor did I calculate that my death would affect them so much. Now all I have to do is repay their loyalty and turn myself into the police. Katakis rushed to answer for John. You're crazy. It's our lives, Jimmy, that are at stake, your mother's life. We're going to keep these two tied up until tomorrow, when we cross the border with the new passports. No one will be able to locate us. You two escape for the moment, but Mrs. Dorsky, as soon as the scandal breaks out, will die, said Konstantin. We won't say anything. Do what you have to do, said John, moved. Victoria hugged Jimmy. Hey, Jimmy, we won't say anything. Juan will recognize the certificate. We'll find a way to put this scandal out. The consul will help us. Jimmy didn't seem convinced. He hugged Vicky and said, looking at her with affection, You guys did everything so well that it will be difficult to get Juan out of the... Juan without the authorities taking action. Then my enemies will understand that I made fun of them. This passport is useless, he said sadly, taking a passport out of his pants pocket. From outside the balcony stood the figure of the man who had followed the couple and who had evidently overheard the conversation. He opened the glass door and entered the room, gun in hand. Everyone raised their arms and looked at him in terror. I heard everything. Very interesting. You are Jimmy Dorsky. You, the consul of Greece. You, Andrade Katakis. You, Missy Turbe. And you, Juan Valadares, isn't it? He said with satisfaction. Everyone nodded. The case is solved for the police and to the satisfaction of Mrs. Candano, who blew the whistle on the case. As he said this, the man took Jimmy's passport, which he held in his hand. He put away his gun and examined it. Let me see your passport. So you must leave the border today, he said calmly. Jimmy did not know what to answer. The others were also silent. Well, have a safe trip and a good memory of Mexico, Mr. Dorsky, said the policeman, handing the passport back to Jimmy, who stared at it dumbfounded. The doorbell rang 3 times. They're coming for the trunk, said Konstantin timidly. The case is closed. Jimmy Dorsky died in an accident. There is no crime to prosecute, added the policeman. At the same hour, in another house in a distant neighborhood, the 2 tall men who had gone to visit Jimmy Dorsky's grave that morning were conferring with 2 other men. The 4 of them were seated around a table where there was a radio and several ashtrays full of cigarette butts. Jimmy Dorsky's case is closed. There is no doubt that he died in a crime or an accident. Too bad. We could have made an agent out of him, said one of the men. He just arrived in Mexico. He is a painter. He has lived for some time in New York and also has family in Prague. We'll have to pick him up tomorrow, said another of the men, satisfied with what he had found.